Hello, everyone. This is the 285th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Irish author Mr. Richard Fitzpatrick as we discuss his book HH, Helenio Herrera, football's original master of the dark arts. Mr. Fitzpatrick is also the author of El Clasico, Barcelona versus Real Madrid, football's greatest rivalry. He is a football writer based in Barcelona and has written on football for the likes of BBC, Bleacher Report, The Blizzard, Business Post, El País, Guardian, Howler, The Herald, Irish Times, New York Times, Panenka, and talkSPORT, among many others. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So, can you please introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
I guess I've been a journalist, freelance journalist for over 20 years, and my background is as a features journalist. I started journalism actually in California and San Francisco, and then spent a couple of years as a journalist in Toronto, up in Canada, and then moved back to Ireland, and I was in Dublin working as a features journalist. And I decided to move to Barcelona in early 2010. And when in Rome, because I was in Barcelona, soccer is a huge part of the culture here. It's a part of the business sector, the small part of the Spanish economy. So the Barca Real Madrid rivalry in the country is huge. So once I got here, I started writing about soccer just because there was such demand for news and stories about soccer. So that's why I kind of got into soccer journalism and pivoting a small bit from feature writing. But soccer itself, I mean, I've always been a soccer fan. I still play it or try to play it five-a-side. I'm a Liverpool fan. As you say in the introduction, I'm Irish. I grew up in a small town in the west of Ireland, and people in Ireland, we only have a semi-professional league in the country. So the kids there support soccer teams traditionally in England, usually the big three, predominantly Liverpool and Man United and Arsenal. And nowadays, my nephew, for example, is a Man City fan. So my brother is a Spurs fan. So I'd always been interested in soccer itself, especially the World Cup, actually. I always loved that tournament. So that's kind of my background in soccer, my love for the game.
So, what sparked your interest to write about the life and career of Helenio Herrera? And what was the research process like as you really get into the weeds regarding all his spells and you paint a picture of the world he lived in, along with the socio-political context, especially in Spain, that is probably a blind spot for most.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess just to answer it, my motivation for writing the book was twofold. As I mentioned, I moved to Barcelona, Spain in early 2010, and 6 months later, Spain were winning the World Cup in soccer in that summer 2010 in South Africa. And I was immersing myself in the history of Spanish soccer and the history of Spain at this stage. Didn't really know much about La Liga and stuff. I knew the broad brush stroke stuff. But the more I understood about the history of Spanish soccer, this figure, HH, as they call him in Spain, Helenio Herrera, loomed large. He's a huge figure in the history of Barca Football Club. He's their first great manager. The club has three kind of cult figure managers, HH in the late 50s, and then obviously Johan Cruyff and his dream team in the early 90s, and Pep Guardiola's team of Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta more recently. So I was intrigued by this character mainly because he was such a flamboyant, outrageous personality. He's referenced in the newspapers here in Barcelona every second day. His phrases like "we'll win without getting off the bus" or "we play better with 10 than 11." But I found him just very, very entertaining. He was an extraordinary character. So moving forward then to about 2015 or 2016, I had been reporting on soccer for 5 or 6 years at this stage, and he'd always been at the back of my mind. But the second motivation then, or the catalyst for diving in to write the book, was I discovered that he was involved in the first white death in soccer, the first death from alleged doping in 1969. At this stage, he was managing in Rome AS Roma, and his star player, a 25-year-old, died from alleged doping. And I was stunned. I didn't know about this story. I was amazed there wasn't more spoken about it. So I had always been interested in doping in sport, particularly the Lance Armstrong case in cycling. Incidentally, it was two Irish journalists who led the charge in bringing down Lance Armstrong, two journalists, David Walsh and Paul Kimmage, who worked for the English newspaper, the Sunday Times. So I was there, gosh, this is a great story. HH ended up on trial for manslaughter for that death. I was there. This is a great way to tackle a doping story in soccer, because I'd reported on doping in soccer, but it's very, very difficult to address contemporary doping stories because the media are afraid of libel. So you really have to skirt around the issue. But when it's involving somebody who's dead, HH had died in 97. It was a good way to tackle the issue of doping in soccer. As regards the research, then this is my third book, and the more books you write, or personally anyway, certainly the more books you write, the better you understand what's involved in writing, doing research properly, also in telling a good story. HH was a good character to build a book around, and there was the thread of the story, which was the doping. I wanted to analyze doping in football. He introduced it to Spain, to La Liga in the 50s, and it was rampant in Serie A in Italy in the 60s, where he went in 1960. So I wanted to thread that through the story, and the research was exhaustive. As mentioned, this is my third book. The first book I wrote took a year to write. The second book took 2 years to write. This book took 6 years just to research and write the manuscript, because I was starting from scratch. I knew very little about the world in the 1950s in Spain and 1960s in Italy, and HH as a personality. So the research was exhaustive, and then spent 2 years editing it after the manuscript was complete. So it was a very long process.
Most football history fans would have a general idea of Herrera's early years and upbringing, from Andalusia to Buenos Aires to Casablanca. What can you say about his early years that led him to France to play football professionally?
Yeah, it was a very brave move by him. He was like about 18 at the time, 18, 19. He got an offer to go to France. He got a kind of half promise that he could get a trial with the Parisian club. There was a Parisian club touring in Morocco where he lived. He grew up in Casablanca predominantly. He was born in Buenos Aires, but moved to Casablanca when he was 3 or 4. So it was on the promise that he could make a career as a professional footballer, professional soccer player. He just wanted to get he was living in poverty in a slum in Casablanca. So he managed to get the money together for a passage to Bordeaux, and he got to Bordeaux and made his way up to Paris and went around to a few football clubs, got trials, and managed to get it signed on with a Parisian club. And that was the launch of his professional playing career in France.
Like many successful managers, his playing career was not exactly glittering. Was he the type of character where he was destined to be a manager?
Yeah, it's hard to know. So, like, he moved to Paris in the late 20s, 1930, around that period. He was a footballer. He had a long career, got his first job in coaching in 44, 45 as a player coach. I don't know when he set off. I don't know what he had going in his head. I guess he had dreams of being a successful soccer player. I don't know if he actually thought about dreaming about becoming a manager. I think a lot of these guys, even today, great footballers, Zidane or these guys, Zidane especially is a good example, because nobody thought he would be a manager, but it's the only way they can stay involved in the game in any meaningful way. So I think that it's when the lights go out as a player, it's what draws them back in or keeps them in the game. So really, we can only speculate, but I think the raw material was there, that he would make a great coach, and he was just obsessed with the game, and he had an extraordinary work ethic, extraordinary stamina. During the Second World War, as his career was winding down, putting all the pieces in place to become great coach. You know, he was training to be a physio. He was training underage teams, amateur teams in the suburbs in Paris while he was still playing. He was also working in a factory during the war. So he was working day and night to keep himself involved in the game. And he had all the pieces of the jigsaw ready when he did become a player coach and a head coach then in the late 40s.
How was this early version of Herrera, the manager in the 1940s in France, different to the future eccentric character?
I don't think it was much different. I think his personality was there from day one. You know, people argue about nature versus nurture. I think he came fully formed out of the womb, flying out of the womb, eager to race through life. He just lived life with the foot off the pedal. He had a huge ego from day one, and he had an extraordinary ambition to succeed in life, to make money, to be known, to be a personality, to have his head in lights or his name in lights. So I think, yeah, that those elements were always there. It was kind of inevitable.
It's fair to say that his legend was really made at Atletico Madrid with the two league titles in 1950 and 1951. Was it also here that his combative personality and the siege mentality was forged, or was it, as you just said, that's how he was from the beginning?
Yeah, I think it was really from the beginning. His legend definitely was forged by that back-to-back league title winning campaigns with Atletico. That was an extraordinary achievement. It's getting on for a century now. Since then, I don't think Atletico will ever win back-to-back La Liga titles. It was an extraordinary achievement. And those behaviors were in place, as you say, the siege mentality, the aggressive behavior, the wanting to own the media. He was a huge star in Madrid at that time. Nobody had seen anybody like him as a coach. He was so outrageous. So, yeah, all the elements were in place.
After spells with Deportivo La Coruña and Sevilla, it's at Barcelona that his greatest successes, as well as his early glimpses of the problems that would follow him, would appear. His obsession with money, strict discipline, micromanagement, including weighing players, controversial statements in the press, and despite winning again back-to-back league titles in 1959 and 1960, there was tension with the likes of superstars like Kubala and Gibor. Was it here that he became the manager star that most know him from?
Yeah, Barca was such a huge club at this stage in the late 50s, or, you know, by the mid 50s. Barcelona was the big club in Spain, one of the biggest clubs in Europe, if not the biggest. Real Madrid only became a great club when Alfredo Di Stefano signed in 53, and they went on a run of extraordinary success. So by the late 50s, Barcelona was a huge, huge club. So although he had been a big personality in La Liga for a decade at this stage, managing one of the biggest clubs in Europe, bigger than Atletico, that really put him in the spotlight. It was extraordinary how famous he was. The greatest player of that age was Alfredo Di Stefano, but HH was more famous than Di Stefano. And that tells you, like, the measure of his fame. People just couldn't believe he was so scandalous. Like, remember in the early 50s, he was involved in denouncing a club for allegedly bribing a referee on national radio. And this was during the worst years of the Franco dictatorship, when population was cowed. For him, a soccer coach, to come on radio and make allegations about bribery, was people couldn't believe it. He was just fearless in making allegations like this. So he was just a huge, huge personality. He loved the limelight, and he just recognized that it was all part of a game, and it was in his own interests to be the center of the story and to make scandal, because he knew match attendances would increase as a result. People were eager to see this guy in action, to take him down. Rival clubs despised him. HH loved nothing than to add a bit of pepper to the fun.
What I really liked about your book is that Herrera's story is not restricted to his interiors as most material would be. But like I said, you really go deep in his spell in Spain, especially at the Barcelona years, that are perhaps seldom discussed and referenced in the English world. Now, how important are these years in terms of understanding Herrera's character?
Yeah, they were huge. I did that very consciously. As I mentioned, I wrote a book about 14 years ago on the rivalry between Barca and Real Madrid. So that rivalry goes back over a century. Barca was founded in 1899 and Real Madrid in 1902. But the rivalry only became a thing really in the late 50s when HH was manager of Barca and Real Madrid was winning the European Cup year on year with that great team of Alfredo Di Stefano and Gento and Puskás. Previously to then, Barca's big rivals were Athletic Bilbao and Espanyol, the rival team in Catalonia, and Real Madrid's big rival was Atletico in Madrid. But in the late 50s, things merged and the great Clasico rivalry between Barca and Real Madrid was born. So I really wanted to examine that rivalry and the impact that HH had on it. Their identities were forged in that period. Barca became HH arrived in 58 as head coach of Barca and they had been on a losing streak for 5 seasons. They had won the league title in 5 years, and he banished their victim complex, which reappeared after he left. There was a lot of conflict in the team, a lot of infighting in the club between rival factions, which we still see today. The club is all the time involved in civil wars between rival factions, and that was never more pronounced than in that era when HH was managing. Half the club was against him, half with him. The kind of artistic temperament, the tragic kind of complex or tragic element that is within Barca, that kind of suicidal impulse the club has was never more evident than with Coxis, one of their star players in that team. And there's a kind of vulnerability to Barca. It's like the club is like a diva. They're always vulnerable to self-imploding. And you can see that, in the Champions League semi-final defeat to Internazionale the year before last, again, or more famously against Liverpool in the 29 Champions League semi-final when they lost 4-0 to Liverpool at Anfield. They have an ability to self-implode, whereas Real Madrid's identity, that never say die attitude, that Real Madrid, they always win finals. They won 5 European Cups in a row in that period. The great remontadas, the comebacks originated in that period. 5 of those European Cup finals, they were behind in them and they came back and won the finals. It became known as a players' club in that period because of Alfredo Di Stefano. He led the team, not the coaches. Nobody remembers the names of the coaches of that Real Madrid team. The club became very solid. The presidents became a huge figure in the club, Santiago Bernabeu. Today we have Florentino Perez dominates or rules the club with an iron fist. There's been great solidity there for 25 years. So the identities of the clubs were forged in that era. And as I mentioned, the cult manager around HH that was replicated with Cruyff and later with Pep Guardiola. So those identities of the clubs became solidified in that era, and I wanted to explain how that came to pass and address some misconceptions about the club as well. I live in Barcelona, so I'm always interested in some of the misconceptions there are around the world about the identities of the clubs. So it was a good way to examine that period of history, of soccer history.
Much of your book also deals with Herrera's administering of amphetamines to his players wherever he went. Was this something that was widely known at the time?
Yeah, this surprised me when I got into doing the research for it, that people did talk about it and they did. It's a kind of doping today in soccer is the elephant in the room. Nobody really discussed it. But in the late 50s, fans were mobilizing in Barcelona. Half the team was split into those players who were happy to toe the line and do the doping, and other players who railed against it, didn't want to take the dope, like Zibora, Kubala, Enric Gensana, other players. And the word got out on the street. Fans mobilized as well. Fans organized a leaflet drop in the stadium. They printed all these leaflets denouncing the doping that HH was doing and passed them around the stadium. I have a copy of one of those leaflets. This amazed me that it was so wide, the campaign against the doping was so widespread amongst both players and fans. So I was really interested to dig further into that.
The legend of Helenio Herrera that most know is when Angelo Moratti signed him for Inter in 1960, and it's the era of Grande Inter and Catenaccio, where he earned the nickname of Il Mago. However, it did not start like that. What was the reference point where Herrera shifted his tactics to Catenaccio?
For me and for most, before I began the research into the book, and I think if you asked any soccer fan who knows about the history of soccer, you ask them about HH, they would immediately say, ah, the Count of Catenaccio, he was the godfather of Catenaccio. That's what he is known for because he practiced Catenaccio so efficiently in the 1960s. But it surprised me. I'm not hugely interested in soccer tactics, but I found it interesting that he didn't, as he claimed himself, he didn't originate the practice of Catenaccio. He said in his memoirs that he came upon the idea as a player in the early 1940s, playing in a match in France. He devised the system. His team were winning a match 1-0 and he wanted to just shut the game down. So he dragged a player from midfield into defence. The teams used to play with a three-man defence at the time. And he moved into full back and had the player as a sweeper and just kind of closed the game down. It's kind of widely accepted that it was actually Karl Rappin who originated Catenaccio in the 1930s as a Swiss coach. But where it becomes important, the discussion of Catenaccio is, so HH arrives to Italy in 1960, takes over Inter, and that first league campaign with Inter stormed into the lead. They were top of the table after about 7 games. They were scoring goals for fun. But around October that season, he encountered great difficulty in unlocking defences from mid-ranking clubs in the league. He had a run of draws and one defeat, a notable defeat against Padua, where he was confounded. He was there, how do I break down these teams? And he noticed that they were using Catenaccio against him. And he said, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So he began using a sweeper in his lineup from then on, who was famous Armando Pichi, one of the great players from Italian football in the 1960s. So he practiced Catenaccio with venom through the 1960s. His great kind of dilemma in football was always about trying to find more space. So playing with a sweeper and playing with overlapping fullbacks enabled him to find more space further up the pitch because it was less crowded. So he essentially was a pragmatist when it came to soccer tactics. For the godfather of Catenaccio, it's extraordinary to think that he set the goal scoring record in La Liga in 1959 with that great Barca team, which stood for over 30 years. That Barca team had an extraordinary line of forwards. Kubala, Luis Suarez was playing in that five-man attack. Sibora, Kochish, Ivaristo, Uligo, Martinez. Every team selection was a new story because they had so many international players in that forward line. So he just used Catenaccio in Italy because it served his purposes and it also suited his temperament. He was a very controlling personality, so it came easily to him.
The Grande Inter era yielded three Scudetti, 1963, 1965, and 1966, two Champions Cup back-to-back, 1964 and 65, with some of the greatest players of that era, such as Giacinto Facchetti, Armando Pichi that you mentioned, Sandro Mazzola, Luis Suarez, who followed him to Inter, Tarcisio Burgnic, among others. Did this team make history and mark its era as it's still referenced to this day? And how important was Herrera's impact, despite the specter of Dejo Solti that you mentioned as well?
Yeah, I mean, they were the team to beat in the 60s, La Grande Inter. They won 3 Scudetti, but they were in the hunt for the Scudetti every season he was there from 60 up to 67. He left in 68. The team's Waterloo was losing in the final of the European Cup in 67 against Celtic, but they were right in the hunt in 61, 62, eventually won in 63, lost in a playoff famously in 64, and then won again 65, 66, and should have won in 67. They had a 4 point lead with 4 games to go, but the wheels came off in May 67. The team was burnt out. It amazed me how competitive that team was year in, year out. At the end of the season, they were in the hunt for all the trophies, the big trophies, Coppa Italia as well. It reminded me of Leeds in that era in the late 60s, early 70s. They just ran out of gas, but they were so competitive in every tournament they entered. There was rejoicing around Europe when they lost to the underdog Celtic in the 67 European Cup final, because they became known as the high priests of anti-football. They were so cynical in playing the defensive Catenaccio system and all the skullduggery in the background. You mentioned Des O'Shalty and the match fixing. So they were absolutely the team to beat in the mid 1960s. Won back-to-back intercontinental cups as well in 64 and 65. So they were an extraordinary team. They had nothing really changes in football. They had the best players. They had the biggest wallet, like Man City, to buy the best players today. So that's how they prospered in many ways. And they had the best coach in the world as well, as it happened.
Following his exit from Inter in 1968, he ends up at Roma. In the tail end of your book, you go in depth regarding the circumstances of Giuliano Taccola's untimely death in Herrera's Roman spell. Did this incident in some ways shatter some of his aura and made some question some of his methods at the time?
It definitely was a big story. He was front page on magazines. The trial was a sensation. But did it really dent his stature in the history of the game? I think it marked the end of his prowess as a coach. Probably the trajectory was on the downhill slide anyway. He was on the road as a coach quarter of a century at this stage. He'd been dominant in Italy or in Spain for a decade in the 50s, been dominant then with Grand Inter for 8 seasons, and he couldn't get a beat out of that Roma team. He was hired to win the Scudetto and didn't succeed in that. He won a Coppa Italia all right in 69 and got to a semi-final of the Cup Winners' Cup in 70. But the trauma of the trial and also match fixing allegations at the time involving his Roma players. Ironically, they were fixing matches to lose, which drove HH crazy. He was used to fixing matches to win. So I think his time had come to an end. He stayed in coaching for another decade or more, but he never reached the heights he had. So I think it was a combination of factors. But to go back to the point, did it really knock the stuffing out of him? I don't think it did, or his legacy or his reputation in the game, because he was inducted into the Italian Hall of Fame. He became a pundit, famous pundit in Italian soccer in the 80s and 90s on TV. So he was a big personality. Unfortunately, we don't live in a very fragrant world. So, we see all the great scandals in Italian soccer over the decades, Calciopoli most notoriously, so involving Juventus. So people, I think, moved on, and what is remembered of HH is the great glories, the trophies he won, more than the scandal.
Reading your book, I saw similarities with Arrigo Sacchi in the manner that he overtrained his players to the point where they must have had enough of him. Is the error of such managers perhaps the fact that they can't find balance?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I would argue it's very hard to find that balance. Like, say, I think the obvious modern day example of what you're alluding to, a coach finding the balance, is Carlo Ancelotti. He's brilliant at, in Spain, what they call managing with the left hand and being diplomatic in nurturing the players, not pushing them too hard, knowing when to push them and when to ease off the reins. But if you look at Ancelotti, he doesn't win Serie League titles. He has moved around from clubs, in Italy and He's the only coach, I think, to win league titles in the five big leagues. Chelsea fans will say the best Chelsea team they've had over the last quarter of a century was his double winning team in 2010. Obviously, he's won five Champions League trophies, then two more than anybody else. So he's an extraordinary manager, but he's not like Pep Guardiola, who wins back to back. Like Guardiola winning four league titles in a row is an extraordinary achievement in the Premier League. Did the same in Bayern Munich, and Barca won several league titles in every country he went to. But they're a different style of manager. Ancelotti can't keep the foot on the gas all along, all the time, so he has to move on from club to club. Whereas a coach like HH or Arrigo Sacchi or Pep Guardiola, they're relentless, and or Alex Ferguson, they have this ability season in, season out to keep driving the players, and it does burn out the players absolutely in the case of all those coaches, but that's their style of management. This word balance is a peculiar word. There are nuances to it. I just don't think you can stay at a club and find the balance and be a coach at a club for 10 years with the kind of balance, because players instinctively will relax if you don't stay on them. So it's a really difficult thing to get right, that balance. As I say, it's a nuanced kind of discussion or idea. That would be my kind of take on it.
For most football historians, Helenio Herrera is synonymous with Catenaccio with Inter. But like we mentioned, that was not the case in his past in Spain and even in his early spell at Inter that we mentioned. Do you think this has gotten lost through the decades and he's just known as Catenaccio, etc.?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think people just the shorthand. I mean, he operated so long ago. Really, we weren't alive when he was at his height. People just remember him, yeah, as the godfather of Catenaccio. Very few people outside of Spain would know that he had such attacking teams. That Barca team of Kubala and the Crystal forwards that played for him at Atletico Madrid or free scoring teams. I found it interesting in researching about HH that he won seven league titles, two with Atletico, two with Barca, and three with Inter in the 60s. And he never had an outright Golden Boot winner in those teams. You know, you think about great teams and they always have a great striker, Raul at Real Madrid or Luis Suarez recently at Barca or Haaland at Man City. But HH, he emphasized more the collective than one star attacking player. I found that very interesting that he never relied on an out and out goal scorer in his league title winning teams.
It's almost forgotten that he actually managed the national teams of France, Spain, and Italy at various stages during his club management career. What is the takeaway of this aspect of his career?
Yeah, I think it says a couple of things. One is about his energy, that he had the stamina to double job to manage national teams. At the same time, he was head coach. He was head coach of this France team in the late 40s and Spain twice in the late 50s and early 60s, and then Italy in the early 60s as well. But it also speaks to you just couldn't do that today because the demands are so great, both of the national team and managing a club team. Interestingly, when he was at Inter, he was doing three jobs at one stage. He was managing the reserve team, which is effectively the youth team, and the first team, and the Italian national team. Coaches also at that stage in the 50s and 60s didn't have as much power around selection and managing the national team, so he would have been part of a kind of a selection committee. He wasn't the out and out head coach with the powers that a head coach like Thomas Tuchel or Pochettino in the USA would have today. So it was a feature just of how soccer operated at the time that he was able to do that team, but essentially came down to his own stamina, that he had the bandwidth to take on those extra roles.
In your research, what surprised you the most about Helenio Herrera that you did not know before?
That's a great question. I think the thing that surprised me the most about it, HH, and did the research for the book, was the violence. He himself, HH, was an extremely violent man. I'm a Liverpool fan, but I'm have an unhealthy obsession with Alex Ferguson. I'm fascinated by Alex Ferguson as a head coach. He was known for his hairdryer treatment. He was a very violent guy verbally, and as a player, he was physically violent. But there aren't really cases of him being physically violent with players. But if HH was angry, he used to headbutt people, and I give a few examples in the book of his violence. He nearly beat an Atletico fan to death after the Atletico fan made fun of HH during a derby match against Real Madrid. At the time, HH's mother had just died, and the fan made the mistake of slandering HH's mother. Even when he was 77, HH was arrested for beating up a car park attendant in Naples. I mean, just this level of violence I found really stark. But I think it was a feature, obviously, of his upbringing. He grew up in the slums in Casablanca, where, he had to look out for himself, and he was a good boxer as a kid. But also, it was a feature of the time. We're talking about a guy who operated in the post-war years. So I was amazed, for example, in the 60s, one of his rival coaches was the head coach of Juventus, Heriberto Herrera, whose nickname was HH2. I remember there was a Juventus midfielder who was involved in a fatal car accident, and HH2 was making fun of him during training shortly after the traffic accident, and he said, "You're not any good. You're only good at killing old people." To kind of slag a player like that in training, it just doesn't happen nowadays. But it was a tough time, like, as I say, coming out of the Second World War, post-war years, a lot of poverty, and people were just, violence was a feature of life then, both verbally and physically. So that violence that was in the game then really surprised me. I mean, HH arrived to Barca in 58 to take over the first team there. Oliveira was a defender on that team. He was the captain of the Spain's team that won the European Championships in 1964. His leg was in a cast, and HH broke the cast off the player's leg. He said he was malingering. He broke it with his own hands, told him to get back training, don't be a softie. So that level of violence really struck me. So I'd say that was one of the things that surprised me most about the research for the book.
Do you think he was a man who was condemned to act in a manner to justify the reputation of a winner that he had built, even in his private life?
Yeah, I think he just couldn't escape his personality and the darker side to his personality. It was forged in his childhood, which was so difficult. I mean, all three of his older brothers died in childhood from poverty. He managed to survive a slum childhood. His father used to have to step over dead people on his way to work in the dark in the morning. H.H. managed to escape poverty, and he had a relentless drive and ambition to be a success, to make money, to have security. So he would stop at nothing to win football matches that was or soccer matches. That was just the way he operated, and he didn't apologize to anybody for being so ambitious. He was really involved, or he really believed in self-improvement. He used to say that people only reached 30% of their capacity or their gifts. He squeezed every ounce out of his potential. He wasn't a great footballer himself, but he still played for 15 years. He just drove himself on. So he got the most out of his potential in life. He was a pathological guy, like a lot of these great people, whether it's in a soccer coach or a CEO of a company or a film director or in any politician in a lot of these fields of endeavor. These people have the blinkers on, and they are just driven to succeed at the cost to their personal lives and to people around them.
There were famous managers before him and after him. But was he the first to understand the media, to make the news about himself and make himself the star and the attraction?
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of his cornerstones was he realized, okay, I'm in the spotlight here. If I make news, it's always good if people are talking about you, even if it is good. He wanted to be in the spotlight, because he knew that by being a big celebrity, by being a big personality, by being provocative, people would talk about him, and it would give him more power. He was fearless in negotiating with the directors and presidents of soccer clubs to get himself greater salaries. When he came to Barca, he immediately demanded a huge salary in 58. He became better paid by his second season, better paid than the star player of the team, the franchise player Kubala. He said the buck stopped with him if he got results. The team was winning and it was up to him. He was happy to take on that responsibility. So he was extraordinary. You asked earlier about surprises, and it really surprised me how much power he garnered at the clubs he operated in. I mean, this guy was at Inter in the 60s. The club was owned by a billionaire, an oil magnate, Angelo Moratti, one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. His wealth was on a par with Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate. Yet Angelo Moratti feared, he was afraid of HH. He used to bribe HH's wife to ask HH favors to do things he wanted him to do in regards to the football team, to play certain friendly matches or team selection, stuff like that. This was one of the most powerful men in the world, yet he was under HH's thumb. The great head coaches in soccer at the time, Matt Busby at Manchester United, for example, or Bill Shankly at Liverpool, those guys, they paid deference to the directors at the club. They were working class men. The directors of football clubs were from the upper class, but HH had no truck with class. He was the head honcho at his clubs. As I mentioned, he was more famous than Alfredo Di Stefano, the greatest player of the era. So it was extraordinary how much power he wielded at these clubs.
Is his antagonism towards Kubala at Barcelona and Angelillo at Inter precisely because he needed to be the focal point and not these players?
Yeah, 100%. It was both for kind of personality reasons. I mean, HH always had to be the guy with his name in lights, not the players. The players weren't the stars. He was going to be the star. So that immediately put him on a road to conflict with those guys you mentioned, Kubala and Angelillo at Inter. But it was also part of his philosophy was no individual is greater than the team. He wanted a collective of 11 players pulling together. He couldn't deal with lazy star players as he saw it. So that was his philosophy, and he was proven right in that. It's very difficult to manage a big ego in a dressing room. The buck has to stop with the head coach unless you have a very wily manager like Carlo Ancelotti, as we managed earlier, who's good at managing egos. But HH had to be the star. I mean, if the player was a goal scorer and was really hard worker, the player's ego didn't matter to HH. But in those two examples, they were never going to work out because they weren't going to be subservient to HH. So there was going to be trouble and there was only going to be one winner.
You already referenced this in our discussion, but a running theme in your book is that he was this determined character due to his abject poverty growing up in Casablanca. Was his life and character forged from this experience?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the childhood makes the man, isn't it? When you come out of poverty like that, that level of poverty, I mean, they lived in a shack made from wood that they've had to move around when the city expanded. They kept having to move further and further out into the outskirts of the city. It was a shack that was overrun with scorpions and snakes. We can only imagine what it feels like to grow up in that kind of poverty. Hunger was always at the door. His mother was completely obsessed with disease because she had lost three sons. So to emerge out of that childhood, you don't forget that. I quoted an Irish playwright, Sean O'Casey, said, hunger is a disease that gets into the bones. Poverty is a disease that gets into the bones. It just never leaves you. So that was the defining feature of his personality, that coming out of that impoverished childhood and wanting to escape poverty for the rest of his life. He was incredibly miserly. He's stashed all his money in Swiss bank accounts and was very miserly with his children and his wives. But it was understandable because he had suffered so much in childhood.
This gets repeated often by the punditry class, but is Jose Mourinho the closest to a modern Helenio Herrera?
Yeah, I'd say he is. Yeah, definitely. If we think of all the great soccer coaches over the last 20 years, or the ones that are still in the game at the moment, because of his personality, Jose Mourinho definitely took things from the HH playbook. The desire to be the kind of the king of the press room, making provocative statements, riling up opposition teams. They were both very charismatic personalities. They are Jose Mourinho is very charismatic. He's also very diabolical, but he does have tremendous charm. I loved him for the first half of his career, but after covering him so closely in those 3 years with Real Madrid, 2010 to 2013, I found his antics really tiresome, and I could see him repeating the same ploys wherever he goes. But yeah, there are huge similarities, definitely. I also, doing the research for the book, found huge similarities with Pep Guardiola, just in their obsessiveness. I think Pep Guardiola doesn't sit still, doesn't rest, he's on it every year. And it was really taken by how Pep's trajectory really closely resembles HH had success at Atletico and Barca. Pep had success at Barca and then Bayern Munich, and then they go on to their last big club. And they were both, HH was at Inter for 8 seasons, and Guardiola was at Man City for 10 seasons, and the wheels have come off over the last 2 seasons. You can see, and it spoke about it this week or last week. It just comes down to burnout. HH was burnt out. That team was burnt out. Grand Inter in their last season or two. Those kind of personalities, HH and Pep Guardiola, they never relax. It's a curse. It must be a curse. HH always had difficulty sleeping. And Pep Guardiola, I remember when he was coaching Barca, used to take sleeping tablets, and they don't have an off button. So it'll be interesting to see. Guardiola's still a young man. He's in his mid 50s. I don't see him sitting on the sidelines like Johan Cruyff, who finished coaching before he was 50. I think Guardiola will be back, probably as he's hinted at, he will be back coaching ahead an international team. But yeah, those two personalities, I saw a lot of similarities, Guardiola and Jose, as you suggest.
In closing, what is the legacy of Helenio Herrera in the history of the game? As managers go, was he the superstar of his era? Will he be remembered for the titles or the controversies or his dogged determination to achieve success with the philosophy?
Yeah, I think I don't know how much impact this book will have. It's got very good reviews so far. It's doing well in sales, but his legacy is, yeah, as the godfather of Catenaccio. He was definitely the star manager in the 60s. He's nailed on as one of the greatest coaches in the history of soccer. So I think his legacy is secure in the history of the game. But I think it, yeah, will be as a byword for Catenaccio, for skullduggery, for me personally, for his absurd views of life and the world. I think he was a hugely entertaining character as well as having some shadows.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Fitzpatrick's book. Again, it's H. Helenio Herrera, Football's Original Master of the Dark Arts, is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Richard, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Great. Thanks, Johan. Immensely enjoyed that chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.